The dropships descended through the thick orange clouds of Avenor 3, their hulls shaking under the violent bursts of atmospheric turbulence. Below them, the planet stretched endlessly, a tapestry of emerald jungles, rivers like veins of silver, and mountains that shone under storms of magnetic lightning. For the cadets of the Galactic Academy, it was supposed to be a test of endurance, intellect, and adaptability. One full planetary year, 380 standard days, with no external communication, no supply drops, and only the natural resources of this unpredictable world. The instructors had called it the Sovereign Trial. The rule was simple. There would be no leaders. Each cadet, regardless of species, would be responsible for his or her own survival. The purpose was to expose natural strengths and instincts. But the moment the ships landed, the rule of no leadership began to tear the group apart. Ethan Cole stepped out into the heat and humidity, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, spongy moss that covered everything like a living carpet. The air smelled of salt and copper. He adjusted his pack and scanned the horizon. Around him, more than 200 cadets were already spreading out, each representing a different world. Draith with their scaled hides glinting under the twin suns. Kelt insectoids with mandibles clicking as they moved in perfect rhythm. The amphibious Lyrans who carried small containers of water on their backs to breathe. And the crystalline Avrine whose translucent bodies shimmered with refracted light. Each group eyed the others with quiet suspicion, as if this lush paradise was already a battlefield. The first day was calm enough. Everyone busied themselves setting up temporary camps near the river delta, marking their territory with flags, banners, or the scent markers used by their kind. Ethan, however, noticed something strange in the air, a faint buzzing, not mechanical but natural, like the sound of wings. When the first swarm appeared over the river that evening, hundreds of cadets ran for shelter. The insects were not large, but their stings left burns that glowed for hours. By the time the storm passed, 3 cadets were dead, and another dozen had severe allergic reactions. Panic spread quickly. Some accused the Lyrans of choosing a cursed landing site, while others demanded to move inland immediately. But inland meant venturing into unknown terrain where sensors failed and communication devices were useless. Ethan stayed quiet, observing. He watched how the Drath immediately began hoarding supplies, using their strength to take extra food packets before anyone else. The Kelt, operating like a hive, moved in groups of 50, collecting wood and stone to build their own fortified nests. The Avrine tried to reason with them, speaking about cooperation, but their voices went unheard. The more the cadets realized that no authority existed, the faster the chaos spread. Arguments turned into fights. Species that had once trained side by side now built invisible borders in the sand. The Galactic Academy had planned it this way. They wanted to see who would lead, who would follow, and who would collapse under pressure. But the instructors observing from orbit could not predict what this experiment would truly become. By the end of the first week, the first real division had formed. The Drath controlled the food storage units. The Kelt dominated construction. The Lyrans, naturally gifted in locating water, claimed the river territories. Smaller or less aggressive species were left to starve. Ethan had seen this pattern before, not among alien races, but in human history. Every civilization, when stripped of structure, returned to primitive competition. He knew how it ended: famine, war, extinction. But unlike the others, he was not designed for aggression or hive instinct. He was human, and humans had learned to survive through cooperation, not domination. He set up his camp far from the others, on a small hill overlooking the river. His camp was simple: a tarp stretched between 2 fallen trees, a ring of stones for a fire, and a small trench to drain water from the frequent rains. He built it quietly, without boasting or attracting attention. At night, the sky turned violet, and lightning rolled through the clouds like living veins of energy. The wind carried strange sounds, something between a roar and a whisper. The cadets barely slept. Some thought the planet itself was alive, watching them. On the 8th night, one of the Lyran patrols stumbled into Kelt territory by accident. The insectoids attacked instantly, driven by instinct and territorial programming. 2 Lyrans died before sunrise. When the news reached the river camps, a full confrontation broke out. Ethan arrived late to the scene, but he saw enough: burning shelters, wounded cadets, and silence from those who had survived. The instructors orbiting above did not interfere. That was part of the trial. Ethan felt the air grow colder. He realized something had shifted. The cadets were no longer surviving. They were descending into destruction. The no leadership rule had created not freedom, but chaos. He walked along the muddy banks, watching the reflection of the moons tremble in the water, and thought about his father, a history professor who once told him that humans survived the Ice Age not because they were strong, but because they built tribes. Survival, his father had said, is not about who fights best. It's about who builds trust first. Ethan understood now that this lesson was not limited to humans. Every intelligent species needed structure, even if they didn't know it yet. On the 10th day, he decided to test an idea. While most cadets searched for food or guarded their borders, he began to explore the terrain. He climbed the nearby cliffs, marked the shape of the valley, and used broken metallic shards from a wrecked pod to carve lines into the dirt. Crude but functional maps. When he returned, several curious cadets followed him, asking what he was doing. He told them he was studying the planet's layout, the direction of winds, the pattern of the rains, and the locations where soil stayed fertile. A few stayed to listen. It was the first real conversation since the fighting began. He noticed how their eyes lit up when he explained how the land could provide for everyone if organized properly. But as soon as he suggested sharing resources, one of the Drath sneered and walked away, muttering that humans always pretended to know better. Ethan didn't argue. He simply kept working. Each day he explored a new section of the land, collecting details about plants, minerals, and animal trails. He wrote notes on torn fabric using charred wood as ink. When the Celt scouts saw him charting, they grew suspicious, thinking he was claiming land. He calmly offered to show them his maps, explaining that he was trying to predict flood zones to prevent future losses. His sincerity disarmed them. The Celt leader, a tall insectoid with scarred mandibles named Raktir, stared at him for a long time before agreeing to cooperate, temporarily. Ethan realized then that information was the one currency more powerful than food. Weeks passed, and the camps remained fractured, but something subtle was changing. Small groups began to mimic Ethan's camp layout, using trenches and shelters positioned away from flood plains. The Lyrans started to follow his advice about water filtration, using sand and stone layers. Even the Drath, though too proud to admit it, began storing food in shaded areas, as he suggested. Without realizing it, they were following his logic. The human had begun influencing the planet's first society without holding any authority. One night, as the storms rolled over the mountains, Ethan sat by his fire and looked toward the horizon where hundreds of tiny lights glimmered. The scattered camps of dozens of species who no longer trusted one another. The wind carried faint echoes of distant shouting. He knew it was only a matter of time before another conflict erupted. Yet something inside him refused to give up. The planet was too vast, too rich, and too full of life for them to die like fools on it. The Academy might have forbidden leaders, but it had never forbidden builders. And that was what he intended to become. As dawn rose over Avenor 3, Ethan stepped onto the ridge, his maps clutched in his hand. The sunlight broke through the mist, revealing the vast valley below, rivers glistening like molten glass, forests pulsing with bioluminescent life, and far beyond, the fractured remains of the cadet encampments. He breathed deeply, feeling both the weight and possibility of what lay ahead. In that moment, he decided that this trial would not end in blood or despair. He would show them that even in a world without rules, there could still be order, if someone was willing to draw it. Ethan woke before sunrise, long before the first shimmer of light reached the horizon. The jungle still breathed in the rhythm of night, thick and wet, filled with the whisper of unseen creatures. The embers of his fire glowed faintly, and thin trails of smoke curled upward, melting into the fog. He rubbed his hands together to fight off the chill, then took a deep breath. The air on Avenor 3 always smelled faintly metallic after a storm, as if the entire atmosphere carried the memory of lightning. He crouched by his camp and unrolled the tattered cloth that served as his field map. The lines he had carved the day before now looked like veins of charcoal, a crude attempt to bring order to a planet that resisted it. He began to expand the map, adding new markings that represented hills, ravines, and the sections of the jungle where the soil turned black and rich. He wasn't drawing for beauty. Every mark had a purpose. The rivers had changed direction twice in the last month due to unpredictable rain patterns, flooding some camps while leaving others without water. Ethan was determined to understand why. The more he studied the terrain, the more he began to see patterns others ignored. How the moss grew thicker on the east-facing slopes. How wind always shifted before the acid rains began. How the strange, luminous birds took flight several minutes before storms hit. These were the signs of survival, and he was the only one paying attention. That morning, he packed a small satchel with dried fruits, a water container, and a shard of reflective metal he used as both a mirror and a cutting tool. He left his camp quietly and moved toward the Central Valley. He walked for hours through thick vegetation, slicing vines and brushing away insects that tried to cling to his clothes. At one point, he crossed paths with two Celt scouts, tall, multi-limbed insectoids covered in bronze exoskeletons. They watched him cautiously from the shadows, their antennae twitching. Ethan raised a hand in greeting and nodded, showing he carried no weapon. The scouts whispered to each other in clicks and hisses, then disappeared into the foliage. He didn't chase them. He knew curiosity was a stronger hook than persuasion. Sooner or later, someone would come asking what the human was doing, wandering the wilderness alone. By midday, the heat became unbearable. The twin suns of Avenor 3 had climbed high, and the air shimmered above the ground. Ethan stopped by a ridge overlooking the valley and drank from his container. The view below was breathtaking. Vast stretches of green broken by veins of rivers and silver plains that reflected sunlight like glass. He imagined what this place could become if the cadets stopped treating it like a prison. The planet had enough to sustain hundreds, maybe thousands, if managed properly. But that would require something no species here seemed capable of yet: trust. He crouched and began carving new lines into the dirt, using a sharp stick to outline what he saw. He marked the main river as a thick curve, then added smaller lines where tributaries split. He used stones to represent the various camps and shaded the areas prone to floods. When he was done, the map stretched almost 2 meters long. It looked primitive, but it told a story no one else could read yet, a story of balance and danger intertwined. As the suns began to lower, Ethan heard footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, hand instinctively moving toward the shard of metal in his pocket. From the shadows emerged a tall figure, Raktir, the Celt scout leader he had met before. The insectoid's movements were deliberate, his compound eyes gleaming with a strange mix of curiosity and caution. Behind him stood 2 more Celt, smaller in build but armed with bone-like spears. Raktir tilted his head and spoke in a distorted version of galactic common. "You make marks. For what?" Ethan stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "To understand the land," he said calmly. "It shifts. It floods. It kills without warning. I'm trying to predict it." Raktir clicked his mandibles. "Predict? The storms are the will of this world. You cannot predict will." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe not the will, but the rhythm. Every storm follows a rhythm, even chaos dances to one." He pointed at the lines. "This valley floods every time the winds come from the north. The river rises here first, then breaks there. If you move your nests higher, your young won't drown again." The insectoid's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Raktir stepped closer and knelt, examining the markings. His claw traced one of the lines. "You watched long." "Long enough," Ethan said. Raktir stood again. "The others think you claim territory. They prepare to burn your camp if you build walls." "I'm not claiming anything," Ethan replied. "I'm trying to give everyone a chance to live through this trial." The Celt leader's antennae twitched again, a gesture of contemplation. "You speak as if you lead." Ethan shook his head. "I don't lead. I learn, and I share what I learn. That's different." After a few moments, Raktir motioned to his guards. They stepped forward and placed several pieces of dried meat and a cluster of black seeds on the ground. "An offering." "For knowledge," he said simply. Then the Celt turned and vanished into the jungle. That night, Ethan returned to his camp, exhausted but alive with a strange energy. The stars were visible for once, scattered across the sky like shards of ice. He ate quietly, staring at the fire, and thought about the day. He hadn't planned to talk to anyone, but the encounter had proven something important. Information could unite even the most cautious species. If one group could be convinced to think beyond instinct, others might follow. He imagined what could happen if the Lyrans shared their knowledge of water purification, or if the Drath used their strength to build instead of hoard. The potential was enormous. The problem was trust, and trust had to start somewhere. The next morning, he woke to find 3 Lyran cadets waiting near his camp. They were tall and thin, with shimmering skin that reflected blue and green hues under the morning light. One of them, a female named Sarai, stepped forward. "The Celt told us you read the rivers," she said cautiously. "Our water pools turned black. Fish die. Show us what you see." Ethan nodded. He took them to the ridge where he had drawn the map and explained how the river's upper current carried minerals from volcanic soil. The minerals poisoned standing water, but purified when filtered through moving channels. "You can build filters," he told them, showing them how to layer sand, charcoal, and crushed shells. The Lyrans watched carefully, repeating his movements with delicate hands. When they finished, the water that dripped through was clearer. Sarai touched it to her tongue, her eyes widening in surprise. "It is clean," she whispered. Word began to spread. Within days, more cadets visited Ethan's camp, first out of curiosity, then out of genuine interest. He never called it teaching, but that's what it became. He spoke to each group in terms they could understand: rhythm to the Celt, balance to the Lyrans, stability to the Drath, and harmony to the Avreen. He drew, demonstrated, and experimented openly, never keeping information for himself. Soon, the once-empty ridge became a gathering point where different species came not to argue, but to learn. By the second month, Ethan's maps had evolved into detailed charts covering several kilometers. He had created color codes using different minerals: red for danger zones, green for fertile areas, white for neutral grounds. Every symbol had meaning. When a group of Drath hunters asked him where to build their food storage, he showed them elevated regions safe from floods. When the Avreen complained about soil erosion, he explained crop rotation and slope reinforcement. Slowly, the chaos that had once defined Avenor 3 began to settle, but peace was fragile. Some cadets resented his growing influence, accusing him of breaking the Academy's rule of no leadership. One evening, as he was sketching new outlines near the western cliffs, 2 Drath confronted him. The taller one, named Korvek, snarled, "You act like a commander. You make rules. You make followers. That is not survival. That is control." Ethan stood his ground. "I don't command anyone. I just share what works. If that threatens you, then maybe control isn't the problem." Korvek's tail lashed the air, but his companion stopped him from striking. "He speaks truth," the smaller Drath said quietly. "Our hatchlings eat because of his plan." After a tense silence, Korvek turned and stormed off. When Ethan returned to camp that night, he added one final mark to his map: a circle connecting all the camps that had accepted his guidance. It was more than a diagram now. It was a living network, proof that reason could survive even in the absence of law. The instructors orbiting above surely saw it through their surveillance drones. He wondered what they thought, whether they considered him a failure for disobeying the rule or a success for transcending it. As the fire crackled beside him, Ethan looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Avenor 3 was no longer just a trial. It was becoming a society. And for the first time since landing, he felt that humanity's gift, the ability to build unity from chaos, was starting to bloom in the unlikeliest of places. By the time the twin suns of Avenor 3 reached their highest point in the season, the valley that had once been fractured and filled with suspicion had started to hum with life. The air still carried the scent of storms, but now it mingled with the smoke of controlled fires, the tang of cooked food, and the rhythmic sound of construction. Ethan walked along the ridge overlooking the encampments and watched how dozens of species moved through the routines that had slowly, almost imperceptibly, grown out of his maps and teachings. What had begun as scattered camps of rivals was turning into a network of settlements connected by shared trade and purpose. Yet he knew that growth without structure would collapse eventually. If cooperation was to survive, it needed form, something greater than his maps or advice. It needed identity. He descended into the main clearing where the air buzzed with movement. The Kilt were hauling massive logs with their six-limbed strength, building platforms over the muddy ground to keep supplies dry. The Drath hammered stones into place, forming walls that curved like scales. The Lyrans tended water pits lined with woven reeds, purifying and storing reserves for dry weeks. And the Avreen, translucent and graceful, documented every task in etched crystal tablets that shimmered under sunlight. It was beautiful in a raw, imperfect way, proof that survival could evolve into civilization when guided by shared need. Yet arguments still flared. The Kelt accused the Drath of hoarding building materials, while the Lyrans complained that others took more water than rationed. Ethan realized the system was still fragile because every species still worked for itself, not for all. That night, sitting by the central fire, he began to draft a new plan in the dirt, a circle divided into segments. Each segment represented a different domain of survival: construction, water, food, medicine, and knowledge. He watched the flames flicker as he thought about the tribes of old Earth, how humans had formed guilds and councils long before written law. Guilds had structure without dominance, purpose without control. That was the key. When dawn came, he gathered representatives from each group and invited them to the clearing. Raktir arrived first, his heightened glinting in the early light, followed by Sarai of the Lyrans and an Avreen scholar named Elith, who carried crystal notepads under one arm. Two Drath brothers came reluctantly, suspicion still written across their scaled faces. Ethan waited until everyone settled before speaking. "We have learned how to survive," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Now we must learn how to live. What we build next will determine if this valley lasts or falls apart." Sarai tilted her head, her gills fluttering softly. "You speak of unity, human, but unity needs law. Who decides when one guild fails or betrays trust?" Ethan drew the circle wider, dividing it into 5 equal parts. "No one rules alone. Each of us builds what the others cannot. The Kelt are strongest in labor. They will be the builders. The Lyrans understand water and growth. They will be the water keepers. The Drath hunt and gather. They will be the foragers. The Avreen observe, study, and record. They will be the lore keepers. And the healers, those who use knowledge from each, will be the medics. Every guild provides for the others, trades fairly, and protects the whole, not one above another." Raktir clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "And you? What are you, human?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "The mapmaker. Nothing more. The lines show where we connect. That's all." The meeting stretched for hours. There was resistance, suspicion, even shouting. The Drath wanted to control food distribution, claiming strength made them natural leaders. The Kelt demanded protection from theft, remembering too many broken promises. Ethan did not argue with them directly. He simply asked questions until they realized the flaws in their own logic. Who builds your walls if the builders refuse to work? Who purifies your water if the water keepers die of thirst? Who teaches your hatchlings if the lore keepers abandon their records? The answers silenced most objections. By midday, a fragile consensus was reached. The guilds of Avenor were born. The next weeks transformed the valley. Flags representing each guild began to flutter over camps, woven from reeds, cloth, or insect silk, depending on the species. The builders carved tunnels into cliffsides to create storage and shelter. The waterkeepers constructed channels that guided rainfall from the mountains into shared reservoirs. The foragers set up hunting routes with markers to prevent territorial overlap. The lore keepers created a library of etched crystal and parchment, documenting everything from medicinal herbs to weather cycles. The medics, a mixed group of Lyrans, Avreen, and humans, experimented with plants that could disinfect wounds or reduce fever. For the first time since the landing, cadets of different species worked side by side, not out of desperation, but by choice. Ethan moved between them constantly, guiding when asked, mediating when tempers rose, but never commanding. He slept little, often falling asleep by the fire with maps scattered around him. Some nights, he woke to see the Kelt guarding his camp, a silent acknowledgement of respect. Other nights, he found Sarai sketching water patterns beside him, her delicate fingers tracing the movement of tides as if painting a dream. He saw how understanding grew quietly between those who once couldn't even share a meal. It wasn't perfect. Conflicts still erupted, but they were solved through discussion rather than blades. One evening, as twilight deepened, Ethan stood at the edge of the new settlement and watched the lights spread across the valley. Dozens of small fires flickered like stars on the ground. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter, a sound he hadn't heard since the academy days before the landing. Raktir approached him from behind, his heavy steps sinking into the dirt. "You changed the rhythm," the Celt said quietly. "Before, we listened only to instinct. Now we listen to one another." "It is strange." Ethan smiled. "Strange isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just the beginning of understanding." Raktir clicked his mandibles, a sound that Ethan had learned was the Celt equivalent of laughter. "The other leaders call this place the Human Village. They say it will fall when you leave. Then we'll make sure it doesn't depend on me," Ethan replied. "If it stands, it must stand because of everyone." The Celt nodded once and left, fading into the shadows. Ethan remained, watching the lights dance below. He thought about how far they had come, how survival had turned into cooperation, yet part of him also feared what came next. The trial still had months left. Supplies could dwindle, tempers could flare, disasters could strike. He knew that unity born of necessity could dissolve when comfort bred greed. He had seen it before, in human history, and he couldn't let it repeat here. 2 weeks later, his fears proved justified. A dispute broke out between the foragers and the waterkeepers after several containers of purified water went missing. The foragers claimed they had been cheated in trade. The waterkeepers insisted the foragers had stolen extra rations. The argument escalated until both sides threatened to dissolve their alliance. Ethan called an emergency meeting of all guild representatives. Tension hung thick in the air as accusations flew. He stood silently through it all, waiting until the shouting exhausted itself. Then he pointed at the center of the clearing, where the guild symbols were carved into stone. "This circle means nothing if we let anger rule it," he said. "The guilds are not walls to hide behind. They are hands to lift each other, so we settle this with proof, not words. The lore keepers keep trade records. The medics track resources used for health. We use truth, not memory." Alith, the Avreen scholar, stepped forward with her crystal notes. After reviewing them, it became clear that the missing water had been taken by a small group of independent cadets who refused to join any guild. When the truth surfaced, both factions fell silent. Ethan did not lecture them. He simply ordered that the stolen water be redistributed equally. The simplicity of his action carried more weight than any speech could. After the meeting, Sarai approached him. "You held the balance again," she said softly. "How long can one man keep it?" "As long as it takes for others to learn to do it themselves," he answered. "I won't always be here, but the guilds can be." As the days passed, the guild system solidified. New inventions emerged: drainage systems, clay storage pots, even a communal kitchen where meals were shared among species. Music began to echo across the camp at night. Deep Celt drumming, Lyran string melodies, and human humming blending into one sound. The settlement had become more than a collection of survivors. It was a civilization in miniature, a promise of what the galaxy could become if species stopped seeing difference as weakness. From the orbiting station above, the instructors of the academy watched in silence. The experiment they had designed to break cooperation had instead created something entirely unexpected. Reports labeled it the human model. Ethan didn't know that yet, nor did he care. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it because he had seen what the world became when no one tried to build something better. As another night descended, he sat beside the fire, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and distant singing. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, and allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Avenor 3 was still dangerous and unpredictable, but for the first time, the danger no longer came from within. The guilds had given order to chaos. And as the firelight flickered over his tired face, Ethan realized something profound. The Academy's trial had failed in its intent, but in that failure, a far greater success had been born. The rainy season arrived without warning. One morning, the sky turned a deep shade of green, and thunder rolled through the mountains like a living beast. The valley that had grown into a network of guilds trembled under the force of endless storms. Rains fell for 12 days without pause, flooding fields, drowning storage pits, and washing away the clay walls that the builders had worked months to raise. The sound of wind never ceased. It screamed through the canyons, carrying branches, debris, and the terrified cries of animals fleeing the highlands. Ethan watched from the entrance of his shelter as the river rose higher each hour, brown and wild, devouring the lower parts of the settlement. He had seen disasters before. On Earth, nature destroyed cities with the same indifference, but here it felt different. The fragile cooperation that held the valley together was not built to withstand such a blow. When the storms finally broke, the valley was unrecognizable. Where gardens had once stood, now only mud remained. The water reservoirs had overflowed, spoiling the purified stores. Food rations molded in the damp. The foragers' huts had collapsed, their supplies scattered downstream. For days, smoke from ruined fires mingled with the mist, giving the land a gray, ghostly hue. Ethan moved from one shelter to another, helping where he could. He carried timber, patched walls, and comforted those who had lost everything. But despite his calm unease grew among the guilds. Whispers spread faster than repair efforts. The foragers blamed the waterkeepers for poor flood control. The builders accused the foragers of hoarding food during the rains. The medics said the lore keepers refused to share herbs. The harmony that had once seemed so strong now began to crumble under the weight of hunger and fear. The first open fight broke out near the central square. A group of Drath foragers, furious over missing supplies, cornered a team of waterkeepers and demanded repayment. When the Lyrans refused, one Drath struck a blow with his scaled fist, and chaos erupted. Ethan rushed to intervene, but by the time he arrived, blood had already been spilled. The sight hit him like a physical wound. Months of progress were unraveling in front of him. He shouted for calm, his voice echoing across the square, but rage had already taken root. He realized that logic and diplomacy were useless once fear had found its voice. That night, he gathered the guild leaders in the remnants of the Great Hall, the one structure still standing after the flood. The walls dripped water, and the floor was slick with mud. Rocktear stood silent near the entrance, his exoskeleton covered in scratches. Sarai sat close to the fire, her eyes dim with exhaustion. Eleth, the Avreen scholar, held her crystal tablet against her chest as if afraid it would shatter with one more argument. Ethan paced the floor slowly. "We built this together," he said quietly. "We gave this place life. Are we really going to destroy it now because of a storm?" Sarai's voice trembled. "It is not just a storm. Our crops are gone. The fish have died. The young are starving. How long can unity survive on empty stomachs?" Rocktear raised his head, his mandibles clicking in frustration. "The foragers steal. I have seen it. My workers starve while they hide food in the caves." "The caves?" Ethan asked sharply. "Show me." The next morning, Rocktear led him to the cliffs beyond the settlement. Inside a deep crevice, Ethan found piles of food, dried meat, grains, and herbs, stacked in the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mold, but the supplies were real. His chest tightened with disappointment. He recognized the markings on some of the storage containers. They belonged to the Foragers' Guild. Still, he needed proof before condemning anyone. He returned to the village and demanded an explanation. Korvek, one of the Drath foragers, did not deny it. "We saved what we could," he said defiantly. "If we waited for the others to ration, we would all be dead. You speak of fairness, but fairness does not fill stomachs." Ethan's patience broke. Fairness built everything you eat. Without it, there would be nothing left to steal. You think survival means taking from others, but you are blind to what happens when trust dies. You destroy more than food. You destroy the reason to live. Korvek turned away, but Ethan saw guilt flash in his eyes. Still, the damage was done. Word spread faster than truth. Within hours, other guilds armed themselves. The Celt fortified their workshops, preparing for defense. The Lyrians retreated to their water huts, guarding the last clean pools. Even the lore keepers sealed their archives. The settlement that had once breathed as one body now divided into 5 wary fragments. That night, the first fires appeared on the horizon. Someone burned one of the builder camps. The flames spread quickly, fed by the dry reeds that had been stored to repair roofs. Ethan ran through the smoke, shouting orders, pulling survivors from the collapsing structures. His lungs burned and his vision blurred, but he refused to stop. He knew what was coming next, a full-scale collapse. He had read about it in every human history book he had ever loved. Cooperation broken by fear, turning to violence, then to extinction. He could not let it happen again. By dawn, the fires had consumed nearly a quarter of the valley. The guild flags that once fluttered proudly now hung in tatters. The air smelled of ash and despair. Ethan stood at the center of what remained of the square, covered in soot, staring at the people who had gathered in tense silence. His voice cracked from smoke as he shouted, "If you fight now, no one will live to see another sunrise." But his words met only hard stares. The guild leaders faced one another, hands on weapons, eyes filled with anger. Then Ethan did something none of them expected. He reached into his satchel and pulled out his oldest map, the first one he had drawn on the day the valley began to unite. The edges were torn, the ink faded, but it still showed the lines of rivers, camps, and trade routes. He held it high for everyone to see. "You want something to fight over?" he said. "Here it is. Every border you built, every path I drew, it ends now." Before anyone could react, he threw the map into the fire. Flames devoured it instantly, curling the paper into black smoke that rose into the stormy sky. The crowd gasped. Sarai stood, horrified. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "Burning the lie," he said. "The map was never meant to divide us. You all turned it into a claim of ownership. You built fences around ideas that were meant to be shared. If this place is to survive, it can't belong to anyone. It must belong to all." For a long moment, no one moved. The crackling of the fire filled the silence. Then Raktir stepped forward. His voice was low but steady. "He is right. The builders cannot work alone. The foragers cannot eat alone. The waterkeepers cannot drink alone. We were fools to forget that." Sarai nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "The water will flow again, but only if we clean the river together." One by one, weapons lowered. The tension broke like a dam giving way. The guild leaders stepped forward, placing their flags into the same fire where the map had burned. The symbols turned to ash, merging into one. The act was silent, but powerful. It marked the death of the old order and the birth of something new. Ethan felt exhaustion wash over him, but also relief. The war that had almost destroyed everything had turned into a moment of renewal. Over the following days, the guilds began to rebuild, not separately, but side by side. The builders repaired the damaged shelters with help from the Lyrans, who used their water to harden new clay bricks. The foragers shared what food remained. The medics treated the wounded without asking to which guild they belonged. The lore keepers carved a new symbol into the central stone, a circle with no divisions. Ethan spent the next week restoring the irrigation system with Raktir and Sarai. He barely slept, but each sunrise brought new hope. The floodwater began to recede, revealing fertile ground beneath. Seeds planted in the mud sprouted faster than expected, nourished by mineral-rich soil. It felt as if the planet itself rewarded their unity. When the first harvest came, it was modest but symbolic. The entire settlement gathered around a single communal fire, sharing the food equally. Music filled the air again. Drums, laughter, and the soft melody of Avrine crystal flutes. Ethan watched them from a distance, leaning against a tree. He was covered in mud and scars, but he smiled. The experiment designed to expose division had instead forged strength. Later that night, Sarai approached him quietly. The firelight danced across her face, soft and warm. "You burned the only map you had," she said. "How will you guide us now?" Ethan looked toward the stars and answered, "I don't need maps anymore. The lines we follow now are not drawn on the ground. They're drawn between us." She smiled faintly and left him to his thoughts. Above, the sky cleared for the first time in months, revealing constellations that shimmered like scattered diamonds. The storms had passed, the war had ended, and something greater had begun. The Valley of Avenor III had learned to live again, not because of rules or maps, but because, for the first time, every living being understood what it meant to be part of something larger than survival. When the storms finally ceased and the air turned clear again, the valley no longer resembled the chaotic settlement that had first emerged from survival. The land was transformed. Fields of green stretched across the plains where once there had been mud and ruin. Wooden walkways crisscrossed the rivers, connecting new clusters of homes that stood on raised stone foundations. The guild flags that once divided the cadets had been replaced with one emblem carved into the central plaza, a ring with no markings inside, symbolizing the circle of unity that now held them together. Ethan walked through the settlement at dawn. the soft orange glow of the sun's glinting off wet leaves, and he felt something he hadn't felt since the first day on Avenor 3, quiet pride. The trial was supposed to break them, yet it had built something entirely new. He moved slowly through the morning mist, watching life return to its rhythm. Two Drath foragers carried baskets of fresh grain toward the communal kitchen, their scales glistening with dew. A group of Celt builders repaired a section of the bridge damaged during the last flood, their coordinated movements echoing like music. Near the waterline, Sarai and her Lyran companions adjusted the filtration reeds while laughing softly among themselves. Even the Avreen lore keepers, once withdrawn and cautious, sat in the open sunlight, documenting everything they saw. The air smelled of wet earth, smoke, and cooked roots, a scent that now meant survival and peace. Ethan paused near the central fire pit, where a large circle of stones surrounded a tall wooden pillar. Etched along its sides were hundreds of names, the names of those who had lived, fought, and died since the beginning of the trial. He traced his fingers across the rough surface, remembering faces that time and loss had taken. He had learned that unity did not mean the absence of grief, but rather the ability to carry it together. Avenor 3 had taught them that survival was not just about enduring nature, it was about enduring one another. The next few weeks passed in calm routine. Each guild resumed its duties, but now no one claimed ownership of resources. The foragers shared food openly with the medics, the builders worked alongside the lore keepers to record architectural techniques, and the water keepers taught the Drath to create irrigation canals. What had once been a hierarchy of survival had become a web of cooperation. Ethan no longer needed to mediate disputes. Problems were solved through quiet discussions led by the guild elders themselves. He had succeeded in the one thing he had feared impossible. He had made himself unnecessary. One evening, as the sun sank beyond the horizon and the sky turned violet, a strange light appeared in the heavens. At first, it looked like another storm approaching, but as it grew brighter, Ethan realized what it was. A fleet descending through the atmosphere. The Galactic Academy had returned. The year-long trial had ended. The ships broke through the clouds, massive metallic silhouettes glowing in the twilight. The sound of engines filled the valley, and the cadets rushed to the clearing to watch. For many, it was a moment of relief, a promise of home. For Ethan, it was a moment of uncertainty. He knew the instructors would not understand what they were about to see. The trial had not followed the script. It had not tested individuals. It had created a civilization. And civilizations once formed did not obey orders easily. When the first landing craft touched down, a group of officers stepped out, wearing the polished white armor of the Academy. Their faces were hidden behind reflective helmets, but their posture carried authority. One of them, a tall figure with gold insignia on his shoulder, stepped forward and surveyed the settlement. His voice came through a translator device, metallic and precise. "Report," he commanded. "Where are the surviving cadets?" Ethan stepped out from the crowd, mud still on his boots, a faint scar crossing his cheek from the fire months before. "You're standing in the middle of them," he said. His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. The officer's visor turned toward him. "Identify yourself." "Cadet Ethan Cole, Human Division, Gamma Group." The officer hesitated. "Where is the command structure? Who led this colony?" Ethan shook his head. "There was no command. That was the rule. We obeyed it." Another officer stepped forward, scanning the area. "You built infrastructure. You established trade, agriculture, governance. That violates the core instruction of the trial." "No," Ethan replied firmly. "It fulfills it. You told us to survive. We learned that survival without structure means extinction. The rule was never the problem. The interpretation was." The officers exchanged glances, uncertain. Behind Ethan, hundreds of cadets stood quietly, representing species that once would never have stood side by side. Raxtir stepped forward and placed one of his hands on Ethan's shoulder. "He speaks for us," the Celt said. "Without him, we would have perished. Without us, he would have failed. Together, we learned what you could not teach." The officer's visor reflected the scene, the settlement, the fires, the mixed group of cadets. After a long silence, he lowered his scanner and spoke softly. The trial was designed to expose division. Instead, it revealed cooperation. The Academy will study this. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Study it if you must," he said, "but don't turn it into another experiment. This isn't data. It's proof that unity isn't born from obedience. It's born from need and trust." The officer said nothing more. He turned to his team and gave the signal. Supplies were unloaded, and medical teams began to assist the injured. The trial was officially declared over. Yet even as rescue ships prepared for departure, many cadets refused to leave immediately. Some wanted to stay a few more days, to see the harvest through, to finish the structures they had started, or simply to walk the paths they had carved with their own hands. The Academy staff allowed it, realizing they were witnessing something far beyond the intended exercise. That night, the valley glowed brighter than ever. Fires burned across the ridges as every species gathered for one final feast. The air filled with laughter, music, and the rhythmic beat of drums. Sarai stood beside Ethan, her reflection shimmering in the firelight. "Will you miss this?" she asked quietly. He looked around, the faces, the lights, the smell of smoke and cooked food. "Every day," he said softly, "but maybe that's the point. We built something worth missing." She smiled and touched his arm gently. "You built it. We followed." He shook his head. "No, Sarai, I only drew the lines. Everyone else filled them with life." When the dawn came, the ships prepared to lift off. The cadets boarded slowly, each carrying something from the valley, a carved stone, a seed, a vial of river water. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the settlement one last time. The wind carried the sound of rustling leaves and distant laughter. He knew that once they left, Avenor 3 would return to silence, its jungles reclaiming the land. But the memory of what had been built there would not fade. Hours later, when the ships reached orbit, the instructors gathered in the observation hall, watching the planet shrink beneath them. On the screens, data scrolled endlessly. Records of weather patterns, survival statistics, mortality rates. Yet among those numbers, one entry stood out. The final report of the human cadet Ethan Cole read, "Trial completed. Parameters exceeded. Avenor 3 settlement self-sustaining." Months passed. Back at the Galactic Academy, a new course was added to the curriculum. It was called the Avenor Accord, the ethics of cooperation in isolation. Every new cadet was required to study it. In the main lecture hall, a model of the valley stood under glass. Tiny huts, rivers, and bridges recreated with meticulous detail. At the center stood a single wooden pillar carved with names, and next to it, etched in silver, was a quote that had become the foundation of a new philosophy within the Academy. "Survival begins when competition ends." Ethan never returned to Avenor 3. After the trial, he continued his studies briefly before disappearing from official records. Some said he joined the frontier missions that colonized distant moons. Others believed he chose a life of quiet anonymity, somewhere beyond charted space. But the settlement he helped create lived on, not in stone or wood, but in the minds of those who had learned from him. Years later, when new cadets passed through the Academy gates, they would look up at the murals painted along the hall walls, scenes of the trial, the storm, and the circle of unity. And among them, always, stood the image of one man kneeling in the dirt, drawing the first map that would one day change the galaxy. Avenor 3 had started as an experiment in survival. It ended as the birthplace of understanding. And for as long as history remembered it, one truth remained. The human who drew lines in the dirt taught the stars how to live together.